Stop scrolling immediately because your grandma's kitchen was actually a certified death trap. And I'm about to prove you are lucky to be alive. You think the 70s were just about groovy disco and bad haircuts? Absolutely not. That decade was a lawless wasteland where we cooked hot dogs with electrocution and ate dinner off radioactive plates that would make a Geiger counter scream for mercy. I have compiled a list of 111 illegal gadgets that were totally normal back then, but would send a SWAT team to your house today. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, or I will force you to eat mystery meat from a rusted can. Let's get dangerous. 1. Imagine a world where cooking dinner meant playing a high-stakes game of electric chair with your food. The Presto hot dogger was a wildly popular 70s gadget that decided heat coils were too boring, so it cooked lunch by shooting 120 volts of raw electricity directly through the meat. You impaled hot dogs on live metal spikes and watched them sizzle from the inside out like a science experiment gone wrong. It gave the meat a distinct battery acid flavor, but the real fun was the danger factor. If you accidentally touched the hot dog while it was zapping, you completed the circuit and became part of the dinner menu yourself. 2. The nuclear family took a literal turn in the 70s whenever Mom set the table with her bright red Fiestaware plates. That iconic orange-red glaze wasn't just a bold fashion statement because the manufacturer achieved that vibrant hue by mixing massive amounts of uranium oxide into the ceramic. You were essentially eating your meatloaf off a low-grade nuclear reactor every single night while completely oblivious to the danger. If you take a Geiger counter to an antique shop today and hold it near these vintage dishes, the device will scream. The government eventually stepped in to ban these radioactive dinner guests, realizing that serving lasagna with a side of radiation poisoning was a terrible idea. 3. Fire safety in the 70s was apparently designed by a supervillain who wanted to turn your kitchen into a chemical warfare zone. People used to hang these glass grenades filled with carbon tetrachloride on the wall to throw at grease fires. It sounds heroic until you realize that when this liquid hits high heat, it instantly converts into phosgene gas, which is a literal nerve agent used in the trenches of World War I. So, while you successfully put out the burning bacon, you also gassed your entire family and the neighbors with a military-grade weapon. It was the only fire extinguisher in history that killed the cook faster than the actual fire could. 4. The most dangerous game of hide-and-seek ever played happened in American kitchens before the government passed the Refrigerator Safety Act. Old fridges had mechanical latches that sealed shut like a bank vault and could only be opened from the outside handle. Innocent kids would hide inside these airtight boxes during a game and realize too late that they were locked in a soundproof tomb. It became such a massive nationwide crisis that laws were changed to require magnetic strips instead of latches. If you see a vintage fridge in a junkyard today, you are legally required to rip the door off so no curious explorer gets trapped inside. 5. Every grandmother in America apparently decided that burning the gravy was worse than contracting a deadly lung disease. They used these fluffy white asbestos mats placed directly over the gas burner to diffuse the heat for a gentle simmer. The problem was that as the heat hit the mat, it started degrading and blowing millions of microscopic cancer fibers right into the air. You were standing there stirring the sauce and taking deep breaths of pure carcinogens while thinking you were just being a good cook. It was sold as a safety device to prevent kitchen fires, but it was actually a silent assassin destroying your lungs one meal at a time. 6. Drinking a soda. Used to be an extreme sport that required a tetanus shot and a prayer before every sip. Before modern cans, we had the ring pull tab that ripped completely off the top of the aluminum can, leaving a razor-sharp metal weapon in your hand. Lazy people would just drop the tab back inside the drink and forget about it until they tilted the can back. Thousands of Americans ended up in the emergency room after swallowing these jagged metal shards that slashed their throats and insides. It was a design flaw so deadly that it forced the entire beverage industry to invent the stay on tab. 7. We treat organic produce like gold today, but back in the early 70s, we sprayed agricultural poison next to the silverware. Every household kept a flit gun or aerosol can filled with DDT right under the kitchen sink to nuke the ants. This is a chemical so toxic it thinned bird eggshells and caused massive environmental collapse. Yet moms were fogging the kitchen with it while making sandwiches. The government finally banned it in '72, But for years, people were breathing in a neurotoxin that is now considered a global hazard. We were basically fumigating our own children just to stop a few bugs from eating the crumbs. 8. The color red was legally canceled in 1976 because of a panic that gripped the entire candy industry. A ubiquitous food coloring called red dye number 2 was found in everything from cake mix to soda until scientists linked it to cancer tumors. The fear was so intense that the Mars Candy Company stopped making red M&Ms for an entire decade just to avoid the bad press. People were terrified that their cherry soda was going to kill them, and honestly, they were probably right. It was a weird time in history where eating anything red felt like playing a game of Russian roulette with your health. 9. Opening a can of beans used to be a slow-acting assassination attempt on your own brain cells. For decades, food manufacturers sealed the side seams of metal cans with a strip of lead solder because it was cheap and easy. The lead would slowly leach into the food, especially if it was something acidic like tomato sauce or fruit cocktail. An entire generation of Americans grew up eating heavy metals for dinner, which might explain some of the questionable decision-making we see today. The industry finally phased it out, but for a long time your pantry was stocking enough poison to lower the IQ of the whole neighborhood. 10. Soda used to come in thick glass bottles that were essentially pressurized frag grenades, waiting for a clumsy moment. These heavy returnable bottles were reused so many times that the glass became brittle and weak from constant washing. If you dropped one or shook it too hard, it would explode with enough force to send glass shrapnel flying across the kitchen. Kids were walking around with bandages because they looked at a bottle of cola the wrong way. It was a legitimate hazard that eventually pushed the switch to plastic, but not before ruining countless birthday parties with a shower of sticky soda and broken glass. 11. Making toast used to be an electrifying experience that could literally stop your heart before breakfast. Old-school chrome toasters were built with metal bodies and simple two-prong plugs that had absolutely no grounding wire. If a single wire frayed inside and touched the outer casing, the entire appliance became live with full wall voltage waiting for a victim. You would touch the lever to pop your bagel and get thrown across the kitchen by a massive electric shock. It was a common household hazard that turned a simple morning routine into a game of survival where the loser got zapped by their own appliance. 12. Ironing your clothes in the kitchen was a double threat of boredom and aggressive lung damage. The fabric covers on vintage ironing boards were often treated with asbestos to prevent them from scorching under high heat. Every time you slammed that hot iron down to press a shirt, you were releasing a fresh cloud of toxic dust right into the breakfast nook. It is wild to think people were crisping their collars while inhaling the same stuff that shuts down construction sites today. You looked sharp for work, but your lungs were slowly turning into a toxic waste dump thanks to that durable cover. 13. There was a time when the pink packet on the diner table was considered a dangerous contraband substance. Cyclamate was an artificial sweetener 30 times sweeter than sugar that was suddenly banned in 1970 after studies showed it caused bladder cancer in lab rats. Overnight, millions of dollars of diet soda and sweetener packets were pulled from shelves like hard drugs during a raid. People were hoarding the stuff in their basements because they were addicted to the chemical taste. The government decided that being skinny was not worth growing tumors, so this popular chemical vanished from the American diet almost instantly. 14. Americans have always been obsessed with burgers, but the Little Mac cooker took that obsession to a fiery new level. This tiny electric clamshell grill was designed to cook a single hamburger patty in 60 seconds flat. The problem was that it got incredibly hot and often lacked a basic on and off switch, meaning you had to plug it in to start the chaos. It frequently burned houses down because grease would overflow onto the heating element while the user was distracted. It was less of a cooking appliance and more of a grease fire starter kit sold to hungry college students. 15. Boiling water for tea required a death wish and a steady hand with these terrifying portable coils. The immersion heater was just a bare metal heating element that you stuck directly into a mug of water and plugged into the wall. There was no safety guard, so if you set it down on the table while it was hot, it would instantly ignite the tablecloth. Even worse was if you touched the water to check the temperature, you could get a nasty shock because the grounding was non-existent. It was the most dangerous way to make instant coffee ever invented by man. 16. Checking if your fudge was ready involved dipping a glass tube filled with one of the most neurotoxic substances on Earth into the pot. Mercury candy thermometers were standard equipment until we realized that glass breaks easily in boiling sugar. When one shattered, parents would often just scoop out the big pieces of glass and keep cooking the dessert because wasting food was a sin. Kids were eating chocolate laced with liquid metal that attacks the nervous system, and nobody batted an eye. Today, if you break one of these, you have to call a hazmat team to evacuate the entire house. 17. Every time your mom sprayed the pan with Pam, she was actively helping to destroy the atmosphere of our planet. In the 70s, aerosol cooking sprays were powered by chlorofluorocarbons, which are the chemicals responsible for tearing a massive hole in the ozone layer. We were literally trading the protection of the Earth from solar radiation, just so our eggs would not stick to the skillet. It is crazy to think that making an omelet was an environmental crime that threatened global safety. The formula was eventually changed, but for a while, breakfast was the biggest enemy of the polar ice caps. 18. We gave children plastic ovens powered by blindingly hot, incandescent light bulbs, and were surprised when they got hurt. These toy ovens used a 100-watt bulb to generate enough heat to bake a cake, which meant the internal temperature was dangerous. Kids were reaching their little hands into a scorching hot plastic box to retrieve a half-baked brownie and getting third-degree burns. It was a toy that taught you valuable lessons about thermodynamics and pain tolerance at a very young age. Safety standards have changed, but those old ovens were essentially teaching toddlers how to operate a blast furnace. 19. This toaster was a marvel of engineering that turned into a flamethrower when things went wrong. It used a mechanical heat sensor to automatically lower the bread without any levers, which seemed like pure magic. However, if the sensor failed or got stuck, the toaster would not release the bread and would just keep cooking it forever. The bread would eventually turn into a briquette of charcoal and burst into flames right on the kitchen counter. It was a fancy appliance that decided when it was done cooking, and sometimes it decided the correct doneness was a pile of literal ashes. 20. Those adorable vintage kitchen utensils with the bright yellow and green handles were secretly poisoning your mashed potatoes. The paint used on those wooden handles was loaded with lead to make the colors vibrant and durable. Over time, the paint would chip and flake off from washing and heavy use falling directly into the food you were preparing. You were serving your family a side of neurological damage with every holiday meal. It took years for regulations to catch up, but if you see a chipped painted handle at an antique store today, you should definitely not use it to cook dinner. 21. If you saw an ant in the 70s, you didn't just step on it, you nuked it with a chemical weapon called chlordane. This stuff was sprayed along kitchen baseboards by parents who thought they were just doing routine pest control. It turns out chlordane is a potent neurotoxin that doesn't just kill bugs, it attacks the nervous system of anything breathing nearby. It stays in the air and dust for decades, poisoning the house long after the ants are gone. We eventually realized that having a seizure was worse than seeing a bug, and banned it for all home use. It was basically chemical warfare waged in the pantry. 22. Making your own sparkling water used to be a gamble with a glass fragmentation grenade disguised as a seltzer bottle. These heavy glass siphons were pressurized with gas to make the water fizzy, but the glass would often fatigue over time. If there was a microscopic crack, you couldn't see the whole bottle would detonate like a bomb, sending sharp shards flying across the room. People were getting lacerated just trying to make a cocktail for their guests on a Friday night. It was a high price to pay for bubbles, and eventually safer mesh-covered or plastic bottles replaced these beautiful but deadly glass cannons. 23. The vertical rotisserie was a countertop gadget that looked cool but acted like a radiator from hell. Instead of an enclosed oven, it was an open-faced heating coil standing upright on the counter, blasting intense infrared heat into the room. It cooked the chicken, sure, but it also melted the plastic wrappers on the bread loaf sitting 2 feet away. There was no door to stop the heat, so your kitchen turned into a sauna, while grease splattered onto the linoleum. It was a fire hazard that demanded your full attention and sacrificed the safety of everything else on the counter just for some poultry. 24. The kitchen junk drawer usually held a handheld hairdryer for quick fixes, and that dryer was often a cancer gun. Early portable dryers used asbestos insulation around the heating element to keep the plastic casing from melting in your hand. As the dryer aged, it would start blowing invisible asbestos fibers right into your face and nose while you styled your hair. You were literally inhaling lung-shredding dust just to get that perfect feathered look before school. It is terrifying to look back and realize our beauty routine involved blasting hazardous materials directly at our heads every single morning. 25. Washing dishes in the 70s was an act of ecological terrorism thanks to phosphate-rich detergents. These soaps were amazing at cleaning grease, but when they washed down the drain, they caused massive algae blooms in local lakes and rivers. The algae grew so fast it choked out the oxygen and killed millions of fish, creating dead zones in the water. You were getting sparkling clean plates, but the local swimming hole was turning into a green slime pit of death. The government eventually stepped in to limit phosphates, forcing companies to reformulate the soap and stop the accidental destruction of the aquatic ecosystem. 26. The old cast iron meat grinder was a beast that demanded a blood sacrifice for fresh burger meat. These heavy hand-cranked machines had an open feed chute with absolutely no safety guard to stop your fingers from going in. You would push the meat down with your thumb, and if you slipped, the gears would grab your skin instantly. It was a common kitchen injury that sent screaming home cooks to the emergency room with missing fingertips. We eventually learned that maybe we should use a plastic pusher tool instead of risking amputation every time we wanted to make a meatloaf. 27. Making homemade butter sounded quaint until you bought an electric churn that had absolutely no respect for personal safety. These glass jars had a motor mounted on top with exposed spinning gears that rotated rapidly to churn the cream. If you leaned in too close to inspect the progress, those gears would grab loose hair or a dangling tie and yank your head down. It was a machinery accident waiting to happen right next to the toaster. We decided that keeping our scalps intact was more important than artisanal butter, and manufacturers finally started putting covers over the moving parts. 28. Displaying your whiskey in a sparkling lead crystal decanter was the ultimate status symbol of class and sophistication during the decade. The problem was that the alcohol acted as a solvent and leached the lead out of the glass and straight into the drink. If you stored liquor in there for a few weeks, it turned into a toxic cocktail with lead levels that would horrify a doctor. You were pouring your guests a glass of poison while thinking you were being fancy. It is a classic case of choosing aesthetics over survival and ruining a perfectly good scotch with heavy metal poisoning. 29. The plastic wrap you used to cover leftovers was doing a lot more than just keeping the air out. Early versions of PVC cling wrap contained plasticizers called DEHA that made the sheets stretchy and sticky. Unfortunately, these chemicals love to migrate out of the plastic and soak directly into fatty foods like cheese and meat. You were essentially wrapping your lunch in a chemical bath that seeped into the sandwich while it sat in the fridge. The formulation had to be changed because eating plastic byproducts was not considered a balanced part of a nutritional diet, even in the 70s. 30. Slicing vegetables was a blood sport if you owned a vintage mandolin without a safety guard. These incredibly sharp blades were mounted on a board, and you were expected to slide a potato across them with your bare hand. One slip meant you were slicing off the palm of your hand instead of a cucumber. They were efficient, but they required the focus of a surgeon to operate without injury. Modern versions come with holders to protect your fingers, but back then you just risked your skin for the sake of perfectly thin scalloped potatoes and hoped for the best. 31. The first microwaves were called radar ranges, and they were basically sci-fi weapons that we invited into our kitchens. These early behemoths were famous for having door seals that leaked radiation like a sieve leaks water. While you were trying to heat up a frozen dinner, the machine was potentially cooking you right along with the lasagna. Rumors flew that standing too close would fry your insides or mess with your pacemaker, and honestly, they were not entirely wrong. It was a brave new world of cooking where convenience came with a side of invisible waves zapping your internal organs while you waited for the beep. 32. If you drank your morning coffee out of a bright yellow or orange mug, you were likely sipping on liquid kidney failure. That groovy 70s color palette was achieved using heavy amounts of cadmium in the glaze, which is a toxic metal you definitely should not ingest. Acidic drinks like coffee or orange juice would leach the metal right out of the pottery and straight into your body. You were destroying your organs before you even left the house for work. It was a colorful way to slowly poison yourself while looking stylish at the breakfast table until the FDA finally cracked down on toxic pottery. 33. We used to trust the government to keep our food safe, but they were literally stamping carcinogens directly onto our steaks. The purple ink used by the USDA to grade meat as prime or choice was made from a chemical called violet number 1. It looked official and safe until scientists discovered it caused cancer in test animals and panicked. The government had to ban their own stamp ink in 1973, admitting that the seal of approval was actually a toxic mark of death. It is the only time in history where the safety label itself was the most dangerous part of the cow. 34. The fondue craze was responsible for burning down more dining rooms than anyone cares to admit. These sets used an open-flame alcohol burner that sat precariously on the table right next to the highly flammable shag carpet. Once the party got going and the wine started flowing, someone would inevitably knock the pot over, spilling liquid fire everywhere. You were dipping bread into cheese 1 second and fighting a 3-alarm blaze the next. It was a culinary trend that combined boiling hot cheese with an uncontrolled arson kit, and somehow we thought it was the height of sophistication for a dinner party. 35. Electricity in the 70s traveled through wires wrapped in cloth that rotted faster than a banana in the sun. Every toaster and blender had these fabric cords that would fray and expose the bare copper wires right next to the kitchen sink. You would go to plug in the mixer and get greeted by a shower of sparks that looked like a mini fireworks display. It was a constant game of Russian roulette where the prize was an electrical fire or a nasty shock. We eventually switched to rubber insulation, but for a long time our appliances were wearing literal rags that wanted to kill us. 36. That classic checkerboard kitchen floor that screams retro cool was actually a surface made of pure cancer. Those 9x9-inch vinyl tiles were almost exclusively reinforced with asbestos to make them durable and fireproof. They were perfectly safe as long as you never scratched, broken, or removed them, which is impossible in a busy kitchen. If you try to renovate an old house today and smash these tiles up, you are releasing a toxic cloud that requires a hazmat crew to clean. We were walking all over hazardous waste while making pancakes and had absolutely no clue until the regulations changed. 37. Trying to be healthy by drinking decaf coffee back then was actually way more dangerous than just drinking the caffeine. To get the caffeine out of the beans, manufacturers used a chemical called trichloroethylene, which is a heavy-duty industrial solvent used to strip grease off metal parts. You were essentially drinking paint stripper every morning just to avoid the jitters. The chemical was later linked to liver damage and cancer, which made the caffeine buzz seem pretty harmless in comparison. It was a health scam that proved removing one bad thing often meant adding something infinitely worse to your cup. 38. The kitchen was the launch pad for one of the most dangerous baby accessories ever invented. We put toddlers in wheeled walkers which gave them the speed of a sprinter before they could even stand up on their own. The kitchen door to the basement was often left open, and these kids would careen down the stairs like a crash test dummy. It was the #1 cause of emergency room visits for infants for years until safety standards changed. We basically gave babies a set of wheels and 0 brakes, then acted surprised when they zoomed straight into danger at top speed. 39. Outlets were scarce in old kitchens, so we used these little brown adapters to plug 5 things into one socket. The cube tap was a cheap plastic workaround that allowed you to run the toaster, the blender, and the radio all at once on 50-year-old wiring. The result was usually a melted outlet or a fire inside the wall because the circuit was screaming for mercy. It was the electrical equivalent of clown car packing, and it burned down countless homes. We traded basic fire safety for the convenience of not having to unplug the can opener and paid the price. 40. People loved collecting this strange greenish glassware that seemed to glow with an inner light, especially under ultraviolet rays. That spooky ghost-like glow wasn't magic. It was actual radiation from the uranium added to the glass mixture. It is called Vaseline glass today, and collectors hunt for it, but eating off it was a questionable life choice. You were serving salad in a bowl that was radioactive enough to register on a Geiger counter. It is one of those things that looks cool on a shelf, but you definitely do not want to use it for your cereal bowl every single morning. 41. Root beer used to taste better because the secret ingredient was a root called sassafras that grew wild in the woods. People brewed sassafras tea for generations thinking it was a natural health tonic that cleaned the blood. The FDA crashed the party when they discovered the main compound safrole caused massive liver cancer in rats. It was immediately banned and branded as a carcinogen, which ruined authentic root beer forever. We were drinking a delicious tumor smoothie on the porch every summer, while thinking it was medicine. Now the only place to find real sassafras is in a chemistry lab or an illicit moonshine still. 42. The thinnest and deadliest item in the kitchen was the plastic bag from the dry cleaners that Mom saved to wrap garbage. These bags were electrostatically charged death traps that clung to human skin like a second face. Kids would find them under the sink and put them over their heads to play spacemen, only to realize they could not breathe. It became such a horrific epidemic of suffocation that the industry had to print giant warning labels on every single bag. It was a terrifying time when doing the laundry could accidentally turn into a crime scene just because a child wanted to play dress-up. 43. The electric skillet was the hero of Sunday breakfast, but it had one massive and explosive design flaw. You absolutely could not get the bottom wet. Because the electrical connections were not sealed against water, people would instinctively dunk the greasy pan in the sink to wash it, and water would seep inside the hidden wiring. The next time you plugged it in to fry bacon, the trapped water would short-circuit, and the whole pan would blow up with a loud bang. It was a kitchen appliance that punished you for trying to be clean by turning your countertop into a combat zone. 44. Taking a hot casserole out of the oven required heavy-duty protection, and the best mitts money could buy were woven from asbestos. They were incredibly effective at stopping heat because asbestos is fireproof, but they were also shedding toxic dust every time you flexed your hand. You were grabbing the lasagna with a glove made of the same material that gets buildings condemned today. As the fabric wore down, it released more fibers right next to the food you were about to eat. It is ironic that the tool meant to save your skin from a burn was slowly trying to kill your lungs. 45. Beer drinkers in the 70s faced a threat much scarier than a hangover called cobalt sulfate. Breweries added this chemical salt to beer to make the foam head stay stiff and look good in commercials. It worked great until heavy drinkers started dropping dead from a mysterious condition called beer drinkers' cardiomyopathy. The chemical was literally enlarging their hearts until they failed completely just for the sake of aesthetic foam. The additive was banned immediately after the connection was made, but not before ruining happy hour. It was a tragic lesson that sometimes a flat beer is better than a heart that stops beating. 46. The kitchen stove was a heavy metal beast that seemed immovable until a child tried to climb it. Ranges were rarely anchored to the wall or floor, so if a kid opened the oven door and stepped on it, the center of gravity shifted instantly. The entire unit would tip forward, crashing down and spilling boiling pots onto the child while pinning them underneath. It was a terrifying physics lesson that happened in homes across America, leading to mandatory anti-tip brackets. We realized too late that our cooking appliances were essentially heavy traps, waiting for a curious kid to spring them. 47. Fancy dinner parties required hot plates, and the solution was a folding cloth contraption wired with heating elements. These electric blankets for your dishes were often insulated with asbestos because manufacturers loved using that stuff in everything. The internal wires were flimsy and would break after being folded a few times, creating a massive fire hazard inside the cloth. You would plug it in to impress your guests and end up smelling burning fabric and toxic smoke instead. It was a gadget that tried to solve a problem nobody really had by introducing the very real risk of burning down the dining room. 48. Opening a bottle of fine wine involved peeling back a foil cap that was made of solid lead. This soft metal wrapper left a toxic residue around the rim of the bottle right where the wine poured out. When you poured a glass, you were washing lead particles directly into your drink and serving them to your friends. The EPA eventually realized that wine lovers were accidentally poisoning themselves and banned the practice entirely. It is wild to think that for decades the sign of a premium vintage was a toxic metal hat that brain damaged the consumer one sip at a time. 49. Ordering the catch of the day became a risky gamble in 1971 when it came to swordfish. The FDA tested samples and found such astronomically high levels of mercury that they advised the public to stop eating it immediately. Millions of pounds of expensive fish were recalled and thrown into the garbage because they were deemed unfit for human consumption. The fish had absorbed so much industrial pollution from the ocean that a single steak was a toxic event. It disappeared from menus for years while people realized the ocean was not as clean as they thought it was. 50. The most embarrassing item in the kitchen catalog was a pair of inflatable plastic shorts called sauna hot pants. They claimed you could melt away fat just by wearing them while you did your daily housework and cooking. You would blow them up like a pool floaty and waddle around the kitchen sweating profusely in your own plastic diaper. It was a scam that did absolutely nothing for weight loss, but succeeded in making everyone look ridiculous. The only thing you lost was your dignity and maybe some water weight while risking heat stroke next to a hot oven. 51. The Polyperk coffee pot was the first plastic electric percolator, and it was a marvel of bad engineering. It looked modern with its colorful flower designs, but the plastic body had a nasty habit of melting when it got too hot. The heat would fuse the internal wiring together, turning the coffee pot into a flaming torch right in the middle of breakfast. It managed to be a fire hazard and a toxic fume generator at the exact same time. You were not just brewing coffee, you were playing a game of chicken with a melting lump of plastic that wanted to burn your house down. 52. Textured ceilings were all the rage in the 70s to hide grease stains, but that bumpy popcorn texture was pure poison. It was made by spraying a mixture containing white asbestos fibers directly onto the kitchen ceiling. It was perfectly safe as long as you never touched it or tried to clean it, which is impossible in a kitchen. As soon as you dusted a cobweb or scraped a bump, you rained invisible cancer dust down into your casserole. We spent decades living under a toxic blanket that looked like cottage cheese and could kill you just for trying to wipe it clean. 53. Drinking milk used to be a high-stakes gamble with tuberculosis before strict pasteurization laws were enforced. People loved the idea of raw milk straight from the farm, but they forgot that cows are dirty animals that carry deadly bacteria. Massive outbreaks of salmonella and TB forced the government to ban the interstate sale of unpasteurized milk to stop people from dying. It was a battle between natural food enthusiasts and the reality of infectious disease. We eventually decided that boiling the milk to kill the bugs was a better option than coughing up blood just to feel like a pioneer. 54. The gas stove in your kitchen used to have a permanent small flame burning 24 hours a day called a pilot light. It was always on ready to ignite the burners, but if a draft from an open window blew it out, you were in big trouble. The gas would keep flowing silently, filling the kitchen with explosive fumes while the family slept. You could wake up to get a glass of water, turn on the light switch, and accidentally blow the roof off the house. It was a constant anxiety source that required checking the stove every single night before bed. 55. Popcorn used to be made in a clear plastic dome that sat on a sizzling hot oil base. These oil poppers got insanely hot to burst the kernels, but the plastic dome was often flimsy and prone to cracking. If the lid failed during the popping frenzy, it would spray boiling oil and scalding corn shrapnel all over the kitchen. It was like a culinary landmine that exploded if you looked at it wrong. The cleanup involved scrubbing grease off the ceiling and treating minor burns on your arms. We eventually switched to air poppers because we got tired of dodging napalm on movie night. 56. Drinking juice was a lot more fun when cartoon characters were painted on the glass, but those colors were deadly. The paint used to draw Bugs, Bunny, or Snoopy. On your morning glass was often loaded with lead to make it bright. Over time, the dishwasher would wear the paint down, causing it to flake off into your orange juice. You were drinking a side of heavy metal poisoning with every sip of vitamin C. It is a nostalgic memory for many, but those faded. Glasses in the cupboard are actually toxic relics that should have been thrown in the trash decades ago. 57. Autumn meant fresh apple cider from the local orchard, but that rustic treat was often a bacterial bomb. Before strict regulations, cider was made by crushing apples that had fallen on the ground, often right into deer or cow manure. Without pasteurization, this raw juice became a breeding ground for E. coli bacteria that sent thousands of people to the hospital. It tasted fresh and natural, but it wrecked your intestines for a week. The government had to step in and force orchards to boil the juice, ending the era of playing Russian roulette with a jug of cloudy cider. 58. Storing knives on the wall sounds like a great space saver until you realize early magnetic strips were terribly weak. You would stick a heavy cleaver or chef knife to the strip and walk away thinking it was secure. 10 minutes later, gravity would win and the knife would detach, raining sharp. Steel down onto the counter or your toes. It was a sort of Damocles situation in your own kitchen where death could drop from above at any moment. We eventually made stronger, rare earth magnets, but for a while you needed steel-toed boots just to make a sandwich safely. 59. The trash compactor was the ultimate status symbol for a modern 70s kitchen, but it was also a terrifying crushing machine. It was designed to smash your garbage into a dense cube, but it had the power to crush anything that fell inside. Curious kids would climb up to see how it worked, or reach in to retrieve a toy and risk getting caught in the mechanism. It was essentially the trash compactor scene from Star Wars installed under your counter. It was loud, dangerous, and smelled terrible, which is why almost nobody has one of these metal monsters in their home today. 60. Drinking beer out of a pewter tankard made you feel like a colonial patriot, but it was actually a bad idea. Authentic reproductions, sold in the 70s, were made with traditional alloys that contained high levels of leachable lead. The acid in the beer would react with the metal, pulling the toxin out of the mug and into your bloodstream. You were getting brain damage with every chug of ale while toasted to your health. It is another example of how trying to be retro and cool can backfire when you ignore modern safety standards for the sake of a vintage look. 61. There was a time when diet soda cans carried a terrifying label that straight up told you they might kill you. Saccharin was the sweetener of choice, until studies suggested it caused cancer in laboratory animals. The government forced companies to print a warning label that said this product causes cancer in animals, which freaked everyone out. You were drinking a soda that basically admitted it was trying to murder you. The science was later debated and the labels were removed, but for a few years, sipping a diet drink felt like an act of defiance against your own survival instincts. 62. The box of aluminum foil in your drawer has always been a hazard, but the vintage ones were bloodthirsty. The serrated metal strip used to cut the foil was razor sharp and exposed along the entire edge of the box. If you reached into the drawer without looking, you would slice your fingertips open on the jagged metal teeth. It was a design that sacrificed human flesh for the sake of a clean cut on a sheet of foil. We eventually learned to tuck the blade inside or use plastic guards, but millions of fingers paid the price for that convenience. 63. The electric carving knife was the star of Thanksgiving, but it was also a handheld chainsaw with a hair trigger. These knives lacked safety locks, so if you grabbed the handle while it was plugged in, the blades would start sawing instantly. People would accidentally turn it on while picking it up and slice through the tablecloth or their own hand. It was a powerful power tool brought to the dinner table and treated like a toy. Dad felt like a surgeon carving the turkey, but one slip of the thumb turned the holiday dinner into a trip to the emergency room. 64. Sleek chrome toasters looked futuristic on the outside, but inside they were insulated with sheets of pure asbestos. The manufacturers used it as a heat shield to keep the metal body from melting or burning the counter. As the toaster wires heated up and cooled down, the asbestos would degrade and release fibers into the air right where you were browning your bagel. You were starting your day with a balanced breakfast and a lungful of carcinogens. It is wild that we engineered an appliance to make toast and decided the best insulation material was the most toxic rock on Earth. 65. Tab Cola was the drink of the 70s until the government decided its main ingredient was a public health crisis. Sodium cyclamate was the chemical that gave Tab its distinct flavor, but it was banned overnight due to cancer fears. Coca-Cola had to scramble to reformulate the drink in a panic, changing the taste and alienating millions of fans. It was a chaotic moment where the government literally raided the soda aisle. You went to the store one day and your favorite drink was gone, declared illegal by the feds because it was poisoning the nation one can at a time. 66. Staying cool in a hot kitchen usually meant putting a box fan in the window, but safety was not a priority. These old fans had metal grates with wide gaps that were easily big enough for a child's fingers to pass through. The metal blades spun at high speed and would slice anything that got too close without slowing down. It was a finger guillotine sitting on the windowsill waiting for a mistake. We eventually mandated tighter mesh guards, but anyone who grew up with these remembers the terror of getting too close to the spinning blades of doom. 67. The portable dishwasher was a chaotic invention that you rolled over to the sink and hooked up to the faucet. The connection hoses were notorious for bursting under pressure or spraying scalding hot water all over the kitchen. Worse yet, if the machine leaked water onto the floor while plugged in, it could electrify the puddle and shock anyone standing nearby. It was the appliance that promised to save you labor but often delivered a flood and a potential electrocution. Washing dishes by hand was annoying, but at least it didn't involve dodging jets of boiling water and live current. 68. The non-stick revolution changed cooking forever, but the chemical behind it was a silent killer. Early Teflon pans were made using PFOA, a chemical that we now know causes cancer and birth defects. If you heated the pan too high, it would release toxic fumes that could kill pet birds instantly and give humans the Teflon flu. We were cooking our eggs on a surface that was chemically unstable and off-gassing poison. The industry eventually phased it out, but for decades. The miracle of easy cleanup came with a hidden cost written in our DNA. 69. Clogged drains were cleared with chemical brute force, using lye-based cleaners that were basically liquid evil. These old formulas were so caustic they generated intense heat that could melt plastic pipes and crack porcelain toilets. If a single drop splashed into your eye, it could cause instant and permanent blindness. It was a product that demanded you wear protective gear just to pour it down the sink. We used a weaponized chemical to fight hair clogs, and sometimes the pipes lost the battle, along with our eyesight. Modern cleaners are safer, but less fun for the sadists among us. 70. Getting ice for a drink used to be a physical battle against a metal contraption that hated you. Aluminum ice cube trays had a lever mechanism that you had to pull to shatter the ice and release the cubes. The problem was the metal would freeze solid and the lever would stick until you applied maximum force. Suddenly it would snap open, pinching the skin of your hand or slicing your finger on the sharp metal divider. You had to bleed for your cold drink. It was a daily struggle that ended with plastic trays, but the scars remain on the hands of boomers everywhere. 71. The electric wok was a culinary trend that tried to bring Asian cuisine to the suburbs, but mostly brought third-degree burns. These gadgets sat on spindly plastic legs that were completely unable to support the weight of the heavy pan. You were heating a massive reservoir of boiling oil on a stand that wobbled if you sneezed in its direction. One aggressive stir of the beef and broccoli would send the entire unit tipping over and splashing hot grease across the counter. It was a physics disaster waiting to happen and turned a fun stir-fry night into a frantic trip to the emergency room. 72. Slow cookers are famous for the set it and forget it convenience, but early models had a dark secret inside the casing. The insulation used to keep the heat inside the pot was often a thick layer of asbestos wrapping. As the cooker heated up and cooled down over years, the asbestos would become brittle and release fibers into the kitchen air. You were filling your house with a slow-release carcinogen while waiting for your pot roast to get tender. It is terrifying to think that the most comforting appliance in the kitchen was quietly waging a chemical war against your lungs all day long. 73. Keeping your cupboards clean in the 70s involved lining the shelves with paper that was infused with a powerful pesticide. Bug-killing shelf paper was treated with lindane, which is a chemical now banned for causing seizures and cancer. People would lay this toxic paper down and then stack their clean plates and glasses directly on top of it. You were essentially seasoning your dinnerware with a fine coating of neurotoxin every time you put the dishes away. It was a product that killed the cockroaches, but also slowly poisoned the family eating off the plates that sat on the paper. 74. Enamel pots were beautiful and sleek, but the bottom surface was often smoother than a sheet of ice. The manufacturing process made the base of the pot practically frictionless when placed on the metal grates of a gas stove. You would turn your back to chop an onion, and the vibration of the boiling water would cause the pot to slide right off the burner. It was like the pot had a mind of its own and wanted to jump onto the floor. Boiling water and heavy metal crashing down on your feet was a constant risk thanks to that slippery design flaw. 75. Deep fryers today have magnetic breakaway cords for a reason, and that reason is the carnage caused by the old ones. Vintage fryers had cords that were permanently attached to the unit and would not detach if pulled. If a child or a pet ran through the kitchen and tripped over the wire, they would pull the entire bucket of boiling oil down on top of themselves. It was a horrific and common accident that permanently scarred thousands of people. The industry finally realized that tethering a vat of molten lava to the wall was a terrible idea and changed the safety standards. 76. There was a massive public health scare that convinced everyone their cookware was causing them to lose their minds. Uncoated aluminum pans were the standard until people realized the metal reacted violently with acidic foods like tomato sauce. The chemical reaction leached aluminum into the spaghetti sauce, giving it a metallic taste and sparking rumors of Alzheimer's disease. While the medical link was never fully proven, the panic was real enough to change how we cook forever. People threw out their expensive pots in droves because they were terrified that their cookware was slowly erasing their memories one meal at a time. 77. We were so obsessed with killing germs that we started washing our hands with a chemical that caused brain swelling. Hexachlorophene was the active ingredient in a popular kitchen soap called Piso-Hex that promised hospital-grade sterility. It worked great at killing bacteria, but it was also absorbed through the skin and attacked the central nervous system. The FDA eventually banned it from over-the-counter sales after it killed dozens of infants in France. We were scrubbing our hands before dinner with a potent neurotoxin, thinking we were being responsible parents while actually risking permanent neurological damage with every wash. 78. Countertop deep fryers were flimsy gadgets that barely contained the violent chemical reaction of frying frozen food. The plastic lids on these units were often lightweight and secured by a weak latch that failed under pressure. When you dropped wet frozen fries into the hot oil, the steam pressure would blow the lid right off the machine. Grease would splatter onto the ceiling, the walls, and the person unlucky enough to be standing nearby. It was a kitchen appliance that turned a side of French fries into an explosion of hot oil that required a repaint of the entire kitchen to fix. 79. Heating a baby bottle in the middle of the night is hard enough without the device trying to electrocute you. Early electric bottle warmers were simple steam chambers with an exposed heating element at the bottom. If you spilled a little water while filling it or touched the wrong metal part, you could get a nasty shock. Sleep-deprived parents were getting zapped at 3 in the morning while trying to feed a screaming infant. It was a cruel design that punished exhaustion with voltage, and it is a miracle that more parents didn't throw these dangerous little gadgets out the window. 80. Blowing out the candles on a birthday cake used to involve inhaling a cloud of toxic lead smoke. To keep candle wicks standing straight and burning, slowly manufacturers used a core made of solid lead wire. As the candle burned down, and you made your wish, the lead vaporized into the air and settled on the frosting. You were literally celebrating another year of life by fogging the party with a heavy metal known to lower intelligence. The Consumer Product Safety Commission finally banned lead wicks, but for decades, every birthday party was a localized hazardous waste event. 81. If you had a bug problem in the 70s, you probably used a chemical called Dursban to nuke the house. It was a wildly popular pesticide sprayed in kitchens to kill termites and ants with ruthless efficiency. The problem was that the chemical caused neurological damage in children who crawled on the treated floors. The EPA eventually realized that poisoning the developing brains of toddlers was a bad trade-off for killing a few bugs. It was banned for residential use, but for years the smell of Dursban was just the scent of a clean, bug-free American home. 82. Carving the Thanksgiving turkey is a tradition, but the tool used to hold the bird was a weapon. The vintage carving fork had 2 long, sharp tines, but absolutely no guard between the handle and the metal. If your hand slipped while you were wrestling with a greasy turkey, your fingers would slide directly onto the spikes. It was a recipe for stabbing your own hand in front of the entire extended family. Modern forks have a safety bar to stop this, but back then you needed a steady grip and a lot of luck to survive the holiday dinner intact. 83. The warming tray was a flat metal hot plate designed to keep the casserole warm during a long dinner party. The danger was that the metal surface stayed scorching hot for a long time, even after you unplugged it. There was no light to indicate it was hot, so Unsuspecting guests would lean on it, or kids would touch it. It was a silent burner sitting on the sideboard waiting to brand anyone who laid a hand on it. It kept the green beans warm, but it also provided a nasty burn to anyone who forgot that metal holds heat. 84. Chest freezers were great for storing meat, but the light inside was operated by a switch containing mercury. A glass tilt switch turned the light on when the lid opened and off when it closed. If that glass vial shattered due to the lid slamming shut, toxic mercury would spill all over the frozen food. You would have no idea it happened and would cook the contaminated meat for your family later that month. It was a hidden poison pill inside the appliance that could turn your winter food supply into a hazardous waste site in seconds. 85. The bright red cherry on top of your sundae used to come with a side of adrenal gland damage. FD and C red number 4 was the dye used to color maraschino cherries and certain pills until it was banned. Studies showed that high doses caused internal organ damage in animals, leading to a swift crackdown. The government allowed a temporary exception just for the cherries because they were considered decorative, but it was still unnerving. You were eating a fruit that was dyed with a chemical deemed too dangerous for almost any other use in the food supply. 86. Before child safety caps became mandatory, the area under the kitchen sink was a deadly candy store. Bottles of aspirin and drain cleaner had simple twist-off caps that any toddler could open in 2 seconds. The medicine often looked like colorful candy, which made it incredibly tempting for curious kids exploring the kitchen. Accidental poisonings were a massive epidemic until the government forced companies to use those annoying push-and-turn caps. We traded the convenience of opening a bottle easily for the safety of keeping the kids alive, and it was definitely the right choice. 87. The electric ice crusher was a loud beast that devoured ice cubes and anything else you put in the chute. It featured spinning metal teeth that crushed the ice, but the feed tube was wide and open. Kids were fascinated by the destruction and would often stick their fingers inside to feel the cold spray. It was a gadget that shredded ice for cocktails, but threatened to shred tiny fingers just as easily. Safety guards were eventually added, but the early models were open-maw monsters that belonged in a horror movie rather than on a kitchen counter. 88. The door on your oven is sealed tight by a gasket, and in the 70s that seal was made of asbestos. It looked like a soft gray rope braided around the door frame to keep the heat inside. Over years of opening and closing the oven, the rope would fray and release dust every time you slammed the door. You were blasting a puff of carcinogenic powder into your face every time you checked on the cookies. It was a durable material that did its job well, but the price was slowly poisoning the person doing the baking. 89. Bread in America is unnaturally fluffy and white, thanks to an additive called potassium bromate. It strengthens the dough and makes it rise higher, but it is also a known carcinogen banned in Europe and Canada. In the 70s, it was in almost every loaf on the shelf and we ate it daily. While it is still technically legal in the US, many brands have removed it due to consumer pressure. We were eating sandwiches made with a chemical that the rest of the world considers a poison, and we just thought it was good baking science. 90. The most shocking thing about 70s kitchens wasn't a gadget, but the behavior that happened inside them. Smoking cigarettes while cooking was totally normal, and every table had a heavy glass lighter and ashtray. People would ash directly onto the floor or near the food while stirring the sauce. The concept of secondhand smoke didn't exist, so kids were breathing gray haze with their breakfast. The tabletop lighter was a fixture of the room, a symbol of a time when we valued a nicotine fix over fresh air and the taste of the food itself. 91. The handheld electric. Mixer was a staple of baking, but the eject button was designed by someone who hated safety. On vintage models, the button to release the beaters was incredibly sensitive and placed right next to the speed switch. You would be mixing cake batter at high speed and accidentally brush the eject button, sending 2 metal beaters flying across the room like shrapnel. These spinning metal missiles would ricochet off the bowl and hit the baker or the wall with terrifying force. It turned a peaceful afternoon of baking cookies into a combat zone where you had to dodge flying metal parts while covered in flour. 92. The picnic table in the backyard or kitchen nook was likely treated with a chemical cocktail called chromated copper arsenate. This green-tinted wood was pressure-treated to resist rot, but the main ingredient was literal arsenic, which is a deadly poison. If you ate food off the table, or if a child touched the wood and then put their hands in their mouth, they were ingesting a heavy metal toxin. We were essentially eating lunch on a slab of solidified poison because we wanted the furniture to last longer than the people sitting at it. The EPA eventually banned it for residential use because arsenic belongs in murder mysteries, not patio furniture. 93. The refrigerator in a 70s kitchen was a cooling beast that ran on a chemical called Freon, which was an environmental disaster. These chlorofluorocarbons were incredibly effective at keeping food cold, but they were also actively destroying the ozone layer that protects us from solar radiation. If the fridge leaked, or when it was eventually scrapped, it released gas that chewed a massive hole in the atmosphere. We were keeping our milk fresh at the cost of giving the entire planet a sunburn. Production of this gas is now strictly illegal globally, because we realize that frozen peas are not worth destroying the Earth's shield. 94. Kitchen curtains needed to hang straight, so manufacturers sewed small metal weights into the bottom hem to keep them in place. The problem was that these weights were made of pure lead, and they were perfectly sized for a curious child to swallow. Kids playing on the floor would find these little metal nuggets and pop them in their mouths like candy, causing instant heavy metal poisoning. It was a hidden danger sewn right into the fabric of the home that nobody suspected until a child got sick. We prioritized neat window treatments over the neurological health of the toddlers crawling around the kitchen floor. 95. The health food craze brought us the electric yogurt maker, which was basically a petri dish for growing bacteria. These gadgets tried to maintain a lukewarm temperature to culture the yogurt, but the thermostats were cheap and unreliable. If the temperature drifted too low, it created the perfect environment for breeding botulism and other nasty pathogens instead of healthy probiotics. You thought you were making a nutritious breakfast, but you were actually running a microbiology experiment that could send you to the hospital. It was a gadget that proved making fermented dairy products at home was a lot riskier than just buying it from the grocery store. 96. Saturday night bean suppers were a tradition, but the heavy ceramic pot used to cook them was often a toxic vessel. The dark brown glaze on these vintage bean pots contained high levels of lead, which gave them that deep, shiny finish. The long, slow cooking time and the acidity of the beans created the perfect conditions for leaching that lead directly into the food. You were serving a hearty meal that was slowly poisoning your family's nervous systems with every spoonful. Collectors love these pots today for their rustic look, but using them for actual cooking is a recipe for a medical disaster. 97. Cleaning the grease off the stove required powerful chemicals, and spray cleaners in the 70s used a solvent called butyl telosolve. This stuff melted grease instantly, but it also soaked right through human skin and attacked red blood cells, causing internal damage. You were scrubbing the counter and feeling dizzy, not realizing that the cleaner was entering your bloodstream just by touching your hands. It was a harsh industrial chemical sold for home use that prioritized a shiny kitchen over the health of the person cleaning it. Formulas were eventually changed to be less toxic, but for a while, cleanliness really was next to sickliness. 98. It was common to keep a crib in the kitchen or dining area so mom could watch the baby while cooking. The drop-side crib was a popular design where one side slid down for easy access, but it was a mechanical death trap. The hardware would often fail or break, creating a V-shaped gap between the mattress and the rail that could strangle a baby. It was a guillotine for infants that caused so many tragedies, it is now illegal to sell or donate them. If you see one at a garage sale today, you should destroy it immediately rather than let another child sleep in it. 99. Making your own peanut butter sounded like wholesome fun until you bought the gadget designed to do it. These grinding machines had weak motors that overheated rapidly and plastic chutes that were impossible to clean properly. The leftover nut residue would get stuck inside the mechanism and grow toxic mold that you couldn't see or reach. The next time you used it, you were grinding fresh peanuts into a mixture of old mold spores and rancid oil. It was a kitchen appliance that turned a simple snack into a biological hazard and usually ended up in the trash after 1 or 2 uses. 100. Vacations to Mexico or Italy often ended with tourists bringing back colorful hand-painted dinnerware to use at home. The problem was that these imported plates were completely unregulated and often used glazes with massive amounts of lead and cadmium. You would serve a festive dinner on your souvenir plates and unknowingly dose your guests with heavy metals. The US government had no control over what tourists brought back in their suitcases, so these toxic dishes ended up on tables across America. It was a deadly souvenir that kept on giving long after the vacation tan had faded away. 101. Renovating the kitchen cabinets was a popular weekend project that often involved a chemical stripper called methylene chloride. This paint remover was incredibly effective, but inhaling the fumes could cause a heart attack in perfectly healthy people. Homeowners would be stripping varnish with the windows closed and suddenly collapse from cardiac arrest due to the toxic vapors. It is a chemical so dangerous that retailers have largely banned it from shelves today. We were risking our lives just to change the color of the cupboards, proving that home improvement can sometimes be a lethal hobby. 102. Feeding a baby in a vintage high chair was a risky operation because of a simple missing safety feature. Older chairs lacked the passive crotch post that prevents a child from sliding out underneath the tray. If the strap wasn't buckled perfectly, the baby could slip down and get their head caught between the tray and the seat, strangling them. It was a terrifying design flaw called submarine effect that turned mealtime into a potential tragedy. Modern chairs have a fixed post to stop this, but in the 70s, we just hoped the baby wouldn't wiggle too much while eating their peas. 103. The 70s loved electrifying things that didn't need to be electric, and scissors were top of the list. These handheld power tools were sold to open milk bags or clip coupons, but they were oddly powerful and dangerous. The trigger was often sensitive, and the blades moved fast enough to slice through a finger before you could react. It was a lazy solution to a problem that didn't exist and added another cutting hazard to the junk drawer. We eventually realized that manual scissors worked just fine and didn't require batteries or a safety briefing to operate without drawing blood. 104. Christmas in the kitchen meant decorating the windows with spray on fake snow to create a winter wonderland. The shocking reality is that many of these flocking sprays were made using actual asbestos fibers to get that fluffy white look. You were spraying a known carcinogen into the air of your kitchen where you prepared food and gathered with family. It looked festive and magical, but it was essentially coating your home in a toxic layer of lung-damaging dust. We literally decorated our homes with poison to celebrate the holidays, which is about as dark as festive traditions can get. 105. A popping candy called space dust hit the market and immediately caused a nationwide panic among parents. It was similar to Pop Rocks, but the urban legend spread that eating it while drinking soda would cause your stomach to explode. It was completely fake news, but the hysteria was so intense that parents were terrified to let kids have it. General Foods had to take out full-page ads to prove it was safe, but the damage was done. It was a candy that was killed by a rumor, proving that in the 70s, we were more afraid of fizzing sugar than we were of asbestos. 106. To keep the baby out of the kitchen, parents used wooden gates that expanded like an accordion with diamond-shaped openings. These gates were perfect traps for a child's head or neck if they tried to climb or look through. A toddler could get their head stuck in the V shape and strangle themselves if the gate collapsed or shifted. It was a safety device that was actually more dangerous than the room it was blocking. They are now banned from sale, but millions of kids grew up navigating these wooden death traps without realizing how close they were to danger. 107. The water pick is famous for cleaning teeth, but in the 70s, they tried to market it as a kitchen gadget. They sold a special attachment designed to blast the silk off corn on the cob using a jet of water. The problem was using an electrical appliance filled with water right next to the kitchen sink was a shock hazard. It was also messy spraying corn juice and water all over the counter and the cook. It was a desperate attempt to find a new use for a bathroom appliance that just made cooking corn more dangerous and wet than it needed to be. 108. Canning your own vegetables was a way of life, but using old zinc lids turned the food into a chemistry experiment. These heavy gray lids were lined with porcelain, but if the liner cracked, the food would touch the zinc. The acid in pickles or tomatoes would corrode the metal, creating a toxic white sludge that dropped into the jar. You were preserving the harvest, but also preserving a dose of heavy metal poisoning for the winter. We eventually switched to coated steel lids, but those old zinc ones were a classic example of durability over safety in the kitchen. 109. Tartrazine, or yellow number 5, is a food dye that turned everything from Mountain Dew to macaroni cheese a bright neon yellow. While not illegal, it caused such severe allergic reactions and hyperactivity in kids that it sparked a massive consumer revolt. Parents were convinced this dye was turning their children into uncontrollable monsters and demanded it be removed. The FDA eventually required strict labeling so people could avoid it, but for a long time it was a hidden ingredient. It was the color of the decade, but it came with a side effect of hives and chaos. 110. To keep a baby quiet in the kitchen, moms would hand them a teething biscuit that was essentially a rock-hard cookie. These biscuits were designed not to crumble, but that made them a serious choking hazard if a chunk broke off. They were practically cement blocks that turned into a sticky glue like paste, in a baby's mouth blocking the airway. It was a soothing treat that required constant supervision to ensure the child didn't suffocate on a piece of dough. We eventually made softer snacks, but those granite cookies were a rite of passage for every 70s baby. 111. The corn stripper was an electric gadget that promised to remove kernels from the cob with zero effort. In reality, it was a handheld device containing a spinning circular razor blade that you held inches from your fingers. If the cob slipped or the device kicked back, you were putting your hand directly into a motorized slicer. It was a terrifyingly aggressive solution to a minor inconvenience that sent core. If you are watching this, congratulations! You somehow survived the most lethal decade in human history without being electrocuted by a hot dog or poisoned by a dinner plate. Seriously, the 70s were a lawless wasteland. Now smash that subscribe button for dumb history and share this with your parents to remind them they are lucky to be alive. And tell me in the comments, which one of these death traps did your grandma actually own? I am betting it was the radioactive dishes. Click right here for more insanity because the past was stupid, and I am just getting started. Flying and fingers bleeding. It proved that sometimes using a simple knife is safer than inventing a machine that looks like it belongs in a horror movie torture scene.